Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo is considered the greatest Mexican novel of all time. I wish I had read it in Mexico. I tried to read it in Mexico, but I couldn't because I couldn't find an ebook version. I found it for $1 in San Diego and sandwiched it into my reading before leaving. Read it between Claw of the Conciliator and Sword of the Lictor. Written in the early 50s. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date of publication, and I read it a while ago. Very important book. It was one of the most important influences on magical realism and specifically on Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It was the thing that pushed him into the stylistic choices that he made in 100 Years of Solitude, I believe. Having read it, I understand why it has such cultural staying power, although it's not as famous as the Marquez books, I don't think. It's about a son who is sent by his dying mother on a mission to reestablish contact with his estranged father. And the son goes to this town where strange things transpire, and very, very, very minor spoilers here. It turns out that most of the residents of this town are ghosts, and the narrative shifts between first person, I recall this being the case, I'm sorry if this is wrong, first person narration from the son having commerce with these ghostly people, and third person narration of the life of Pedro Páramo, who was a local despot. Sorry if I'm terribly backlit and terribly sweaty and out of breath and discombobulated. I came up here with a bottle of water and I don't have water anymore because I was mugged by a monkey. And it happened live on camera while reviewing an Adam Roberts book for the Patreon. So if you want to see me get mugged by an ape, then patreon.com/bookpilled. Although the book is short, it took me quite a while to read. I intended it just to be a quick in and out between the Gene Wolfe books, and I sat with it for about as long as I did each of those individual Book of the New Sun books. There's a lot in the story that is implied, that is happening almost subliminally, and it has a starkness and a strangeness and a darkness that is reminiscent of some science fiction and fantasy stuff that I've read, of course, because that's mostly what I've read because I'm a nerd, but absolutely beautiful. I think one of the more, advanced novels that I've read. The general thing that I recall is a feeling of being quite moved just being in the presence of Juan Rulfo, who was an interesting character too. He only wrote 2 books. He wrote this and he wrote a short story collection, and that was it. And Pedro Páramo was such a hit that I guess he just felt that his legacy was secure and that he didn't need to say anything else. But he took, I think, over a decade to write Pedro Páramo. And it's something that I feel I should return to and reread. I have this sense of obligation with certain books and certain authors like Kafka. I feel almost a sense of guilt for having not read Kafka in so long. Or Anna Kavan, Ice, I feel like I'm almost obligated to go back and reread it more carefully, and I feel the same way about Pedro Páramo. I think it does benefit probably, and this is what I hear, people have told me this too, that you benefit in your reading if you have some backgrounding in Mexican history and Mexican politics, which admittedly I don't. I think a more careful reread on that front as well is in order. I absolutely recommend it. It's aged beautifully, I mean just immortally well. If you're into strange, melancholic, experimental fiction, then absolutely read this one. After I finished Book of the New Sun, I read Limmy's memoir. Limmy is a Scottish comedian who's also my favorite comedian. He does mostly sketch comedy, although he does some spoken word stuff. And if you're not familiar with him, you should really seek him out. He got famous for doing these really simple, sort of slice of life, understated sketches that are him playing most of the characters. And this is a norm in comedy that's just become so commonplace that it's cliche, of filming yourself on your phone at different angles, doing different voices and characters. As far as I can tell, he invented that, or he was the first one to really popularize it all the way in the early 2000s, like 2000 or 2001 or something. He was filming himself on camcorder, then publishing these videos to the internet, to just his website while he was working as a programmer. He did flash animations for some company. And that was the thing that gave him his first little jolt of notoriety. And just by word of mouth, he became popular on the internet. And then that led to him getting a pilot on the BBC. And Limmy's show ran for, I believe, 3 seasons, or series as it's called there. Limmy himself is really interesting, and his story is really interesting. And the way that he wrote it is very interesting. Oh my God, what the hell? A crazy bug has been spotted. Hold on a second. Look at this. Super interesting guy, had a really rough upbringing, and the way that he wrote the book is very unadorned and very, you can tell that he was trying to be straight down the middle, not overly modest or not self-aggrandizing. He was trying deliberately not to be authorial or to write in this grandiloquent is the word way about himself. And I think that that is tough. That's really hard to do. And the next memoir that I read was Werner Herzog's memoir, and he definitely did not do this. And I think that that recommends this as a really interesting piece of writing, because Limmy, you know, he's not Proust. He's not, like it's rather straightforward, but because it's so incredibly honest and transparent and non-performative, it elevates it to this position where I was really, really moved by it. I think it would be really easy for him to have gone in the direction of Million Little Pieces, or playing it for sentimentality, or writing himself to be this tragic figure or to be a sympathetic figure, and he does the opposite almost. He almost portrays himself as the villain of the story. He talks about these emotional lapses, I guess, that at times feel almost sociopathic, and he talks about his sexual failings in really, like, not extreme detail, but in surprisingly candid detail. And you just get the impression that he's not fully sold on himself being the hero of the story. But consequently, I found it just so easy to relate to him. And by the time the clouds part and he starts getting these victories and gets the pilot, you really are cheering for him. If you don't know Limmy already, if you haven't seen his stuff, I don't know that you would resonate with it as much as if you had, but I recommend that you go find his stuff and watch it, and then read the book if you like what he's doing there, because I think this is probably my favorite memoir. Then I read Herzog's memoir. It's the second that I've read from him. I read not Burden of Dreams, you imbecile. It was Conquest of the Useless, which was his filming diary from Fitzcarraldo. Werner Herzog is a filmmaker, largely known for being Werner Herzog. Herzog's personal mystique is in some way as important to his public impact as his body of work, for better or for worse. Does this make you feel comfortable? Herzog is Herzog. Herzog is his own character, and maybe on some level his own industry. Herzog is kind of used, not in a pejorative way, as a punchline of sorts. Outside of the weirdicisms and the impressions and the Herzogianisms, and oh, Herzog reads a children's book, how hilarious. Outside of all of that, the man is a genius. The man has created a body of work that will probably live forever, and some of the most interesting, compelling, and moving pieces of film I've ever seen. I prefer his documentaries. He does both documentaries and fictional films, just straight. How do you just say movies? Movies, I guess, movies. He claims to not think that there is a difference between the two, and his approach to making documentaries is similar to his approach to making movies, and that he's perfectly comfortable embellishing and selectively editing to create narratives in pursuit of something that he calls the ecstatic truth. I think that he does something similar in this book. in that there are anecdotes that read either as very embellished or totally fictionalized, but overall the impression is of this guy living a life that spans what feels like 3 centuries. He was born in a village in Bavaria, raised around characters that are straight out of Tolkien, and then of course goes on to become Werner Herzog. If you watch a lot of Herzog, there will be material in this that will be familiar to you because he repeats certain Herzogianisms that are stock trade for Werner Herzog now. And I don't love criticizing Werner Herzog, who's someone that I really, really deeply admire. But I think that his willful participation in the myth, the Herzog myth, I think is slightly to his detriment, at least in the book. He's an excellent writer, could have been a writer had he not become a filmmaker. And I know reads prodigiously. I do recommend it, especially if you're a Herzog fan. It's sort of like a best of album of Herzog sound bites. But at the same time, he's such an excellent writer that it doesn't really matter that you've heard and read these things before from him because they're rendered so absolutely beautifully in parts. If you haven't seen Herzog's movies, then absolutely see Herzog's movies. I review every single book that I read, including all of these, in long form on my Patreon. That's $5. And I'm behind on these videos. I think there are 6 or 7 more books up on Patreon right now that you can go peruse. Okay, thanks for watching.